Here comes the Battle Royale.
If you ever rushed home to catch Dragon Ball Z on Toonami, or begged your parents for one more pack of Pokemon cards, you were part of the largest cultural takeover in modern entertainment. But none of it was designed to entertain you. Japan built the machine because its economy had collapsed, and animation was one of the few things it had left to sell. This is exactly how a financial crisis turned Japanese animation into the most permanent cultural export on the planet.
The Robotech Defenders and Challengers come into your home in the dynamic new television series beginning April 1st. 85 thrilling half-hour episodes.
Before the boom, anime didn't enter the West as anime, it entered as parts. Robotech in 1985 spliced 3 unrelated Japanese shows into one product to hit the 65-episode syndication minimum. And Voltron did the same thing the year before. Japanese names were erased, plots rewritten, and every show was designed to sell American toys, while the studios that actually drew them never saw a cut of the merchandise. Then Akira landed in 1988, 160,000 animation cells, a budget that dwarfed anything anime had attempted. And it proved animation could be violent, philosophical, and aimed squarely at adults. It moved over $80 million in home video worldwide. Yet anime still couldn't break into the mainstream. The appetite was real, but the way to sell it to the world didn't exist yet. And then Japan's economy collapsed.
Japan, the land of the rising stock market in 2013, but as share prices have risen, so have the worries that Japan is seeing the inflation of an epic new bubble.
It hit in 1991 when Japan's asset bubble finally burst. The sponsorship model that had funded anime since Osamu Tezuka's Astro Boy in 1963, where one company funded each show, fell apart once no sponsor could carry that weight alone. Studios found themselves pinned between rising production costs and vanishing budgets. And the industry wasn't just slowing down, it was dying. And what came out of that desperation was the production committee system. Instead of one sponsor carrying the full weight, they spread the risk across 5, 6, 7 investors at a time. Publishers, toy companies, record labels, and broadcasters all putting in a fraction. Neon Genesis Evangelion in 1995 became the proof of concept. Hideaki Anno's deeply personal, borderline unwatchable deconstruction of the mecha genre generated $400 million in merchandise and home video sales within 2 years, and every company on the committee saw returns. It didn't just revive a stagnant domestic industry, it proved the committee model could be wildly profitable. Today, roughly 80% of all anime is produced this way. The model, though, carried a trap baked into it from the very first day. Studios became flat-fee contractors who created the art while the committee owned everything. Committees didn't care where the revenue came from. Domestic, international, it landed on the same line of the spreadsheet, which meant if the West would buy, the West would be sold to. That single structural shift is what turned anime from a domestic product into a global export machine. Not out of passion, not out of cultural generosity, but out of survival.
And I say on behalf of the moon, I shall right wrongs and triumph over evil, and that means you.
The export machine was running and Japan was selling, but the Western gatekeepers who controlled distribution came with one condition: stop being Japanese. DiC licensed Sailor Moon in 1995 and performed surgery on it, renaming every character, cutting full episodes, and bolting Sailor Says moral segments onto the end because American broadcast standards demanded that cartoons teach children lessons. Saban and Ocean Group took the first crack at dubbing Dragon Ball Z, cut it for content and time, but the show was pulled after just 2 seasons. Then came 4Kids Entertainment, the most aggressive Americanization factory in the business, digitally painting over Japanese text, renaming characters wholesale, swapping rice balls for sandwiches, and stripping out anything that might remind American children they were watching something from another country. But every other country Japan sold to proved it didn't have to be this way. Dragon Ball arrived in France in 1988 and dominated the country for years, with a dub that adapted some names but never tried to hide where the show came from. Latin American dubs were even more faithful, keeping character names intact and cultural identity untouched. And nobody outside America was digitally erasing Japanese text or pretending rice balls were sandwiches. So So the Americanization wasn't a translation problem, it was a business decision. That business decision paid handsomely. After Pokemon launched in the US, 4Kids' net income jumped from $2.7 million to $23.7 million in a single year, on sales of $60.5 million. Let that land for a second. The people profiting most from anime in the 90s were the ones stripping away everything that made it anime, while the production committees back in Japan never objected because the checks kept clearing. Thus, the system was designed so that nobody with the power to stop the erasure had any financial reason to try. What the gatekeepers hadn't accounted for, though, was the volume. They could control the filter, but they could not control how much was about to come through it. The takeover came from every direction at once, and each wave landed bigger than the one before it. The takeover came from every direction at once, and each wave landed bigger than the one before it. The Prestige track moved first. Ghost in the Shell bypassed children's TV entirely, landing on US home video in 1996 after a brief art house run. By August, it had topped Billboard's video sales chart, the first Japanese film to ever pull that off. It went on to move over 200,000 copies uncut and on its own terms. Then the Wachowskis screened it for producer Joel Silver and told him they wanted to do that for real. 3 years later, The Matrix became a global phenomenon built on its visual language. So Hollywood wasn't just watching anime anymore, it was building on top of it. And when Miramax's Harvey Weinstein demanded cuts to Princess Mononoke for its 1999 American release, Ghibli's Toshio Suzuki reportedly sent him a katana with a message: no cuts. It managed just $2.3 million in US theaters, but the statement was permanent. There was now a tier of anime that would never bend for a Western gatekeeper. Meanwhile, the cable economics kicked another door open from a different direction entirely. Toonami launched on Cartoon Network in 1997, desperate for programming. And when it picked up Dragon Ball Z's 53 dubbed episodes in August 1998 and ran them on a loop, the show that had been pulled became the highest-rated program on the network. By 2002, Dragon Ball Z held the #1 spot on all of American television in the boys 9 to 14 demographic, outperforming both The Simpsons and Survivor. The economics behind them were devastatingly simple. Anime cost a fraction of original Western animation to license, which meant cable networks got premium content at bargain prices, while Japan got a direct pipeline into millions of living rooms, bypassing the old gatekeepers entirely. And then, Pokemon detonated the entire argument. The anime premiered on American TV on September 7th, 1998. The Game Boy games followed 3 weeks later, and the trading cards landed in 1999. By that November, the franchise was on the cover of Time magazine, the first video game property in history to appear there, and already worth roughly $7 billion worldwide. But what set Pokemon apart was the machinery behind it. 4Kids sold the broadcasting rights across Canada, Latin America, and Europe immediately, while Nintendo rolled the games into Australia and then Europe. In just 18 months, a single Japanese property saturated the Western world, turning anime from a niche import into a mass-market commodity. Finally, Cowboy Bebop sealed the last gap when it became the first anime to air on Adult Swim on September 2nd, 2001. Jazz scored Noir, built for grown adults who would never pick up a Pokemon card. It ran in near-continuous rotation on Adult Swim for over a decade, becoming the show that proved anime could hold a sophisticated Western audience night after night. And with that, anime held every audience segment that mattered: kids, teenagers, art house cinephiles, and adults, until there was no more demographic left to convert. And the numbers told that story on their own. Anime Expo went from 1,750 attendees in 1992 to roughly 13,000 by 2001, while the North American anime home video market peaked at $415 million in 2002, and total anime-related spending in North America reached $4.84 billion by 2003. Now, those numbers don't just come from a trend passing through. They come from an infrastructure being poured into the ground. here's what I keep coming back to. By 2024, Japan's anime industry generated over $25 billion a year, with 56% of that revenue coming from overseas markets. So the country that once had to let American gatekeepers gut its work just to get it on air now owns the global entertainment pipeline outright. But takeover isn't the word that matters most here, though. Forever is, and here's why it's earned. Every other foreign cultural wave that happened in entertainment eventually faded. Kung fu films in the 70s burned hot, then disappeared. Bollywood's Western crossover came and just went too. Meanwhile, anime didn't just take over, but it actually stayed. Because it went further than just changing what people watched, it permanently rewired what global audiences expect animation to be capable of. And the generation that grew up on Toonami now produce anime-influenced work as their native creative language. Shows like Avatar, The Last Airbender, Castlevania, and Arcane. That influence isn't imported anymore, it's embedded in how the West tells stories. It also goes beyond what's on screen. Manga outsells American comics in their own domestic market, holding nearly half of all graphic novel sales in the United States. Cosplay grew from convention hobby to global social phenomenon. Words like kawaii and senpai sit in the vocabulary of people who've never even watched a single anime. And the infrastructure Japan built in the 90s, the licensing pipelines, the convention ecosystem, the fan communities, none of it disappeared when VHS died. Instead, it all migrated to streaming and multiplied. Crunchyroll and Netflix built dedicated anime operations. Now audiences worldwide treat it as a default, not a foreign curiosity. The 90s didn't create a wave, they poured the foundation. The 90s anime boom was built, not born. A survival mechanism forged by economic collapse, weaponized by a financing system that valued revenue over its own creators, filtered through Western gatekeepers who tried and failed to strip its identity, and delivered to a generation that never realized they were being permanently converted. Japan didn't just take over pop culture. It built the infrastructure that ensures it can never be taken back, and what came next is its own story.